So, purportedly, I'm live at the moment, but since it didn't work yesterday, I'm just making sure to see if it shows up on the YouTube page so I don't speak for an hour and nothing happens. Because that sucks. Kind of. So yeah. I'm going to start talking as if this is live because otherwise it will be a bizarre silent video. How strange it doesn't show up that quickly though. There it is. Okay, so I am live. Okay. Yeah, so I'm going to be, let me just check. Do I show up here? Yes. So I've been doing this class. I'm going to try and make this like the concise version. I've been doing this class online, which is by this guy called Rasmus, Mark Rasmus, Sifu Mark Rasmus. He's a Tai Chi / Qigong master who lives in Thailand. And he also is a master of the F.R.S. Bardon material. So if you follow this channel for any length of time, I often discuss the books of F.R.S. Bardon, which include books such as Initiation into Hermetics, The Practice of Magical Evocation, and The Key to the True Kabbalah. There's also another book called Frabato, and another one called like The Golden Key, I think it's called. But this is the first three books, which are sort of like the important ones for practice. So Bardon thought of himself as a reincarnated Tibetan Lama, and it seems to be that a lot of the practices line up with a lot of the Tibetan practices, although it's got a sort of a large amount of, well, actually less, but I mean, it's got quite a bit of magical practice in there too, but less than a lot of magical books, because this is a magical book which is actually focused on the actual real materiality of reality, I guess, right? Or the immateriality of reality and how that functions. So I've obviously been studying this for a while. Plus, when I started studying that stuff, it seemed like it was a bit out there, you know, because you don't really know what you're doing. But then after the initiation, everything just started working and everything made sense, and all the esoteric practices just seemed to work. So there's a whole bunch of esoteric practices in Initiation into Hermetics, which is kind of like the foundational book. You can't really do the other two books unless you've mastered the first book. And actually, you can't really do the first book unless I think there's 12 steps in the first book, and so unless you've really mastered like steps 1 and 2, you can't do anything, basically. And those steps come down to becoming aware of energy, right? And in the book, the way that's discussed is one of the ways of becoming aware of it is through breathing. Now, we often think of breathing in terms of, these days, in terms of like Wim Hof and this kind of stuff, or pranayama, and like are you doing the fast breath, or doing the four-sided breath and this kind of stuff. But the way it's discussed in Initiation into Hermetics is breathing in a sort of more granular way. So whereas in most of these other practices you're just breathing, right? You're just using the breath. It's divided up into the elements. So like sometimes you'll breathe in fire, sometimes you'll breathe in water, or the earth, or air, or akasha. And so these have specific effects on your body. Now, they won't have specific effects on your body at first because it will all seem like it's imaginary and BS, right? But what happens is, as you start imagining these structures, those in the imagination begins sort of building an interface into understanding what these things might actually mean, right? And so while at first breathing fire might feel a little weird, or breathing water, after some time, what happens is you start building relationship conceptually with what those things are, and it starts kind of like working for you. Now, for me, I did that initiation, and then everything was working. But even then, there were some aspects of it which were more resistant than other ones. So, for example, the concepts of light and fire, very, very easy to enter into. Like just instant evocation of light and fire to a really high extent. By contrast, like I found working with the earth kind of not interesting. Like I didn't really want to do it. And then things like air, it was like I didn't really understand it at first, right? And so there's like different challenges. So you get one challenge like I'm not interested, the other one is like I don't really understand this, right? And then the core fire thing, no problem, right? And then water, I understood that a bit more, but that took a little more time to get into. But there's like a challenging aspect. Now, over the years, of course, I've got more comfortable with a lot of this stuff, right? And it's become really useful. Of course, the book I always mention, which really helped me understand some of the concepts of this, is Energy Work by Robert Bruce, which is a really simplified version of just like the first couple of steps. He doesn't mention it that way, but it's just kind of like trying to get you comfortable with like energy. And interesting, the way he works with it is very much in like a qigong kind of way, which brings me back to Mr. Sifu Mark Rasmus, who also works with this stuff in a sort of not sort of qigong way, in a qigong way, and I found that really valuable because, as I said, one of the things I found which I wasn't really interested in was the earth element, and the earth element represents in a lot of ways the physical world, and moving or understanding the transition from some of these other forces, from like, for example, light, or for example, fire, but being able to like see the transition down to the earth element, that's valuable, because what it represents is it represents understanding. But it represents it's not just understanding, it's it's like an appreciation of the actual mechanics between different levels of consciousness and how that affects your life. So like some people, for example, can be enlightened just by like doing yoga. It's like they're just doing this physical action, or the Kundalini yoga, and boom, they're enlightened. Other people like Krister, who was doing the transmissions of the non-dual transmissions, the rasa transmissions, he became enlightened just by using the intellect, right? And he was analyzing logical structures, and right. And then other people can do it through the imagination and the water element. Now, my particular affinity seems to be the imagination and the water element, cultivated with fire. I discussed this a bunch of times, but like one of the things that I was doing at one point was I was working with the chakras and really sort of visualizing the chakras as you might see them like in a chakra book, right? Like you got the 4 petals on Muladhara, and you've got the 6 petals on Svadhisthana, and the 8 petals, I think it is, in Manipura, representing earth, water, and fire as you move up. But I would spend a lot of time cultivating the visual, right? and thinking about what kind of material, like if there are petals there, what are they made of, right? What are the petals? What are they actually made of, Scott? I would say to myself. And I would actually start like visualizing it. And what's interesting about this is like, as you ask questions about the actual structure, that actually pulls you into the visualization because you're actually curious. There's like a curious desire to learn more about this imaginary structure. Now, I was reading something yesterday, and I actually did this. I feel a little weird doing this because this is the second time I've done this video. I did a video yesterday about an hour and a half, and it didn't record, which was unfortunate. It looked like it was recording, but I did it, and it didn't grab, which sucks. But there was a really good quote, which I'm not going to be able to find now because Facebook sucks. It was on my memories, but it was a quote from Leonardo da Vinci, who was discussing that the only way you can actually educate yourself is through desire. Because if you try and study something and you don't actually have the desire, it's like trying to get light in a Christmas tree without a plug, right? It's like you've got a filament, the filament of desire. The fire energy is what actually makes, if that empowers the whole cascading system of knowledge and education. And similarly, that filament of desire is what can pull you into actually understanding how to push a visualization into a higher state. So this is one way you might do it, is you would look at like a chakra. I'm just doing this by way of comparison, because I'm going to talk about something else in a few minutes. You would look at the chakra. What's the materiality of the chakra? Now, eventually, and so the way I was doing this, and this is something this is something I can read. It was something I was talking about recently on on the YouTube community. And on the YouTube community page of this channel, I posted a couple of things here which were quite interesting. One of those things was I was rereading the book by, what the hell is the book called? There's a really good book. It's called, let me just look it up again. I forgot what it's called. It's Tantric Kali by Daniel Odier. Daniel Odier is a writer. He writes a lot about tantric stuff. But the Tantric Kali book's pretty good because it approaches a lot of sort of common knowledge from the perspective of Kali. But one of the interesting things about it is it's got perspective on the chakras, which is not that strange to me, but it will seem strange to many people, especially people from a Christian background or whatever, right? Because it seems out there, man. Yeah, I'll just read this part to you because it's quite interesting. And what this represents some ways of thinking about the chakras, right? Now, in some, not all translations of the Tantras, the chakras are often referred to as yonis or vaginas, right? It's and that's really done more from the perspective of like the womb of creation kind of stuff, right? Anyway. Dude, there's so many cool things about this. Okay, but let me skip all that. That stuff's good too. But in the third chapter of the Yoni Tantra, the 8 goddesses or powers of Shakti are placed in the Yoni, which is worshipped as the dwelling place of the goddesses. Its essence is absorbed by the yogi. Kali and Tara are in the chakra of the yoni. Chinnamasta is the pubic fleece. Baglamukhi and Matangi are the labia majora. Mahalakshmi and Shodashi and Bhuvaneshwari are hidden inside the yoni. The insertion of the lingam into the yoni is a great sadhana spiritual practice. The most important thing is the recitation of mantras, and the sadhana is the flow of sperm and of pleasure. The yoni is considered to be the essence of the cosmos. The interest is there. What interest there is there in bathing in the Ganges and visiting sacred sites? Nothing equals devotion to the yoni. The sadhana of the yoni is the greatest sadhana. In several tantras, it is asserted the absorption of the sublime essence of the yoni cures illnesses. Women are divine, women are life, women are the real jewels. The yoni tantra makes a close connection between the sadhana of Kali and the adoration of the yoni. This liberates the yogi from the energy of the pashu, the crude man, and transforms him into a hero. So this is the thing, is that so often sexual energy is veiled or cloaked as like, oh, it's a dirty thing, or it's enveloped in trauma, essentially. And that's not actually the natural state, because this is actually the mechanics of sexuality, are actually the reproduction. It's part of the divine process, right? And so that's really all that's happening here, is trying to recognize these things as what they really are. And so that's something you can bring to a practice of visualization of the chakras. Obviously, thinking about a petal might be boring, right? But analogically, if the petal becomes the yoni, then there's like a metaphoric potentiality to focus the mind, right? So the thing is the mind wants to roam everywhere, and it rarely wants to stay at any place, except oftentimes you can rein the mind in with a sexual thought, right? And so the idea is the mind by default is going to have this sort of prurient attitude, and you allow it to engage in the prurient attitude with the underlying knowledge that below the prurient attitude is the divine reality. But it's enough to engage the mind, and that focus creates absolutely perfect concentration. And concentration is really important, because as Sifu Mark Rasmus says, wherever there's concentration, there's akasha, and wherever there's akasha, there is potentiality for nirvana and other states. So, one of the things I discovered is that as you're focusing on the chakra with specific details, what I discovered was, like, if this was a petal, I would be moving my consciousness back and forth sensually across the petal of the chakra. And as I was doing this by itself, as if by magic, what would happen is there would be like a zooming in effect. And all of a sudden, I'm looking at this chakra in a much more detailed level. And I'd start noticing that there would be like diamonds and like filigree, almost like lace or something, like details like of gold and this kind of thing. And what I realized is like, wait, this is happening by itself. And so what happens is when you push will or desire into, if you allow desire to penetrate into the astral world, that has enough energy to provoke life in the astral world. And you can witness the provocation as the astral world starts sort of self-constructing based upon the will that was pressed into it. I got to tell you, it's really astonishing. It's hard to believe that works or that that's true, but it's true, and it's unbelievable. It's truly astonishing. What I discovered too is once that started happening, now you're like really focused, because you're like, what? And now your focus goes in even tighter into like a laser, and you're focusing on this new thing. And now you don't have to focus on generating imaginatively. It's doing it by itself. So now it's just pure focus. So it's not just, it's been purified because you're not thinking about anything now. It's just like a focus on what's happening. And this new focus pierces through this layer of the astral world and sometimes moves into another layer. Now, as this is happening, sometimes what will happen is you'll start focusing not on the visuals, but on the actual construct. Like, how is this working? And so by doing this, you sort of change the lens, you sort of change the point of focus. And as you change the point of focus, you start becoming aware of the structure which is allowing this to happen. And that's when you start seeing mechanical structures which are made of pure consciousness, which you can't really describe to anybody. But they have like I often describe them as sort of opalescent. There's like an opalescence to them, which just seems like it's kind of got sort of divine quality to it. It's of a higher order of intelligence. I think of it as like science fiction kind of a thing. But highly advanced mechanics. What does that even mean? Angelic? Alien? Divine? I don't know what it is. But this is what is revealed as you change focus between these layers. Now, by the time you reach this state, this is really, you're getting into sort of a very high state of consciousness. You've provoked eternal creation in the astral world. You've changed focus, and you're seeing the mechanics of pure consciousness. And around the stage, or a little bit higher, you're moving into like the akashic realms, right? And at this time, that is just, it's hard to / impossible to describe this, but it feels just like a divine space, right? It feels like a divine space. And that space is what happens is you're in this space, but you've got incredible focus. And so what happens if you adjust your focus just slightly, just sort of finally refocus, and this is a great place where you could evoke a spirit or a deity. And you can do this obviously by doing things like mantras, but oftentimes you just have to think briefly about, like say Ganesha, and you just think about the trunk or the eye, and all of a sudden, as you're thinking about this, what happens is, in the same way those diamonds start appearing, what happens is I don't want to say fractals, but it's almost like if you've ever seen those paintings in those Muslim temples, it's like they're like fractals, but like all of a sudden that stuff will start emerging. It's like all the artistic details which might represent the palatial habitat of a deity like Ganesha, they start appearing to you, and it's like this infinite majesty, studded with diamonds and gold, and it's really astonishing. Obviously, I mean, it's obviously an astonishing experience. It's not a common experience, this kind of stuff, but this emergence of the deity in this akashics, it's really astounding. Now, oftentimes you might just stop there because it's already, you've made contact. I think when I started doing this, I would just keep pushing and pushing, and then like it would get so huge, and then it would be like a major life event. Whereas these days when I do it, once I get to that stage of I'm in the divine space, it's enough, you've done it. But the point here is to see there's like a transformation of energy, right? And the transformation, you could and probably should define that as being defined by the elements, if we think of the elements in their various aspects. So the fire would represent the desire. The water would be the imaginative plane. The mental aspect, which is the problem, the reason the mental aspect or the air element is so difficult, because like the air, it's invisible and it's hard to grasp the air. And the intellect it's very precise, and you know, if you've ever read any intellectual treatise, they can be difficult to understand. So it's like a really what, and so it takes practice to get used to the intellect and see how it's interacting with the other elements. Like the water element, like the emotion and the imagination, that's easy to see, right? The desire, you don't really see it, but you feel it. And then the intellect and the way it interacts with these things it's a bit more tricky. And so one of the things, like in Buddhism, is this practice called noting, where you'll just note various things happening in consciousness. And so that's really a great way of working with this stuff too, is just noting. And sometimes you'll be wrong, right? It doesn't matter. The important thing is to just know it. So sometimes, like if you know it elementally, this can be really important, right? So as you're, for example, if I'm like looking at the mechanics of pure consciousness, if I'm looking at the, if I'm looking at the infinite creation of the astral plane, right? And then I think, okay, I'm going to change perspective. That thought is part of the mental body. So that would be the interaction, right? And so rather than trying to change focus, really, what I might do is I'd start focusing on the structure, the logical structure, and how that interacts with the astral plane. And that specific place might be what you would call the astral mental matrix. That's what Bardon calls it, right? So you've got this place which is the astral mental matrix. It's a place which calls on you to sort of, I don't want to say reimagine, it's redefine how you are working with consciousness. And this is an interesting point, because the thing is these elemental, conceptually, the elements are recursive. You can see this in a lot of Vipassana books. Like a lot of books in Vipassana discuss like how different ways of imagining the elements, right? So for example, you can imagine the elements to be like in your body, like the bone could be the earth element, the blood could be the water element, the skin could be the air element, because that's touch is air. And so there's different ways of looking at that. But if you look at that description, I'm discussing the elements, but I'm talking about the elements in the physical body. So I'm talking about the elements inside physicality, or inside earth. So it's the elements are all contained inside earth, right? And all the elements are also contained inside of water, right? So there's different ways of evaluating the elements in each level of reality. So if you're in the earth element, the physical reality, you can evaluate things here based on the elements. When you move into the astral zone, you can evaluate the astral world based on the elements, and so forth and so on. And this is reflected in many practices. So for example, in Kabbalah, the Sephiroth or Sephirot are often described as sort of representing the elements, but each Sephiroth also has all the elements and all the Sephiroth inside of it. So each section encapsulates, it's recursive, encapsulates the same thing, right? And so that's something which can trip people up when they're thinking about this stuff, because it's like what is that all about? And so this is slowly, as you note these things, what happens is the noting almost, it's like, and I've said this before, noting is kind of like adding metadata to a photo. So you've got a visual image and you're noting stuff, and you'll probably forget it, but consciousness doesn't forget it. Your ability to note states of consciousness is added like metadata. And what happens is when higher consciousness is looking at you and sees noted metadata beside it, it realizes that, oh, this person is actually working with consciousness, and you get promoted, maybe, I don't know. But all of a sudden, you get more access to stuff. And it doesn't happen suddenly. It happens over a period of time where you get access to stuff based on awareness. So, yeah. So I've had this practice for a long time, and then I sort of stopped doing it. And one of the thing is being able to recognize, for example, the whole thing about the chakras being sexually oriented. That's a really profound realization. And it can be easy to think that Tantra is about sex. And a lot of people say it's not about sex. Vigorously, which I find quite odd, because it's clearly... Because the people who say it, like, sort of laugh about it, like, it's not about sex. But that just seems like a very weird block that they've got. Because it could be about sex as much as anything else, right? If anybody who's got any kind of like negativity about sex has some kind of veil, they've got some kind of traumatic encapsulation around that. I think that's really common, right? I mean, that's something I've confronted, and it's something that everybody confronts when you're dealing with this material, right? And so part of the whole process of doing this is what Sifu Mark Rasmus would call as demagnetizing, deconstructing or demagnetizing those energetic structures to release them, right? So that you're not caught up. Because the problem is, if you're doing Tantra and you think, well, it's not about sex, I mean, that's really creating a dichotomy, right? I mean, in my opinion, that's crazy, right? The problem is those separations as above, so below. It's not just saying it here. They create separations in the astral plane and in the mental plane, all this stuff. And probably the separation is actually coming from the physical plane, because I'm not sure about this, but it seems like trauma, childhood trauma, seems to be stored like in the fascia and in the body. And so those emotions are emerging out of some kind of like physical trauma and creating this bifurcation of like, no, we are only holy. We are only holy people. We don't think about these other things. Whereas like, and the physical is like dirty or something. So there's this aspect where there's got to be like this sort of cleansing. Like there's going to be like a cleansing of these sort of channels of consciousness which want to subdivide awareness into categories of arbitrary categories, we might say. I'm just checking. Every now and then I'm checking to make sure this thing's still recording, because I don't want to do another hour and a half and have nothing happen. Excuse me. Let me grab some yerba. So, having said that, once you've demagnetized those categories and you've come to realize, okay, this is actually a good point. It's a good time to mention the other part, which I wanted to read earlier, which I didn't read. And one of the things in the Tantric Kali book, one of the things that happens mythologically is that Kali is really, there's not much ways to talk about this, but in the creative process, she's metaphorically fucking everybody, right? Because the sexual process is the creative process. So she's just like bleeding creativity all over creation. It's out of control. And so Shiva, there's like a dance between Shakti and Shiva, right? Shakti/Kali. And that's sometimes also discussed as the relationship between Purusha and Prakriti. Same thing. And this is also sometimes visualized with, I'll just read it. But it's an interesting thing. I'll get to this in a second. Shiva is called on by Durga to help appease Kali. He does not use the power of his lingam. So she's running around being creative, trying to use the sexuality of the yoni to be creative. And he's not going to use the lingam, which is the wand of power, right? Which I use specifically because the wand is the symbol of fire energy in the tarot. Instead, he transforms himself into an infant in order to bring out Kali's protective and material instinct. This is how worshippers see her. They become infant Shivas who suckle life, audacity, and nonconformist at the breast of Kali. So, her yoni contemplates the cosmos. In certain visualizations, her clitoris becomes the eye that contemplates the infinite, bringing heaven and earth together. It is from the yoni that the lingam emerges, meaning that the strength of Shiva, the architect of the world, emerges from the absolute power of the feminine. But what's interesting there is that the way to transform sexual energy isn't by denial, it's by transformation into the mother, right? And that by nature, it's what it is. It represents a change. It represents a transformation of energy, not a denial of energy, right? It's following the alchemical process to its to one of its conclusions, right? Which is the transformation of the mother. So this is something that I often do if I'm like working with somebody, or if I don't really do this myself anymore. But at one point when I was working with sexual energy. At first, it was like all this crazy sexual energy and uncontrollable. And similarly, what had to happen was it had to be visualized transforming into like, oh no, it's part of this cosmic process, right? That's what it is. In this case, symbolized by Kali turning into the mother, right? And so that is an important alchemical process, I would say, to make sense of these unbelievable energies. Now, one of the interesting things here is that the focus of meditation penetrating into the astral world to continue the metaphor, it sort of inseminates the astrality, and that's why life is formed. Right, the life is formed, and that's why you see these imaginative structures beginning to build themselves. And you're like, and it's also one of the big dangers of the astral world, because if you're exploring this and you're not sure how to manage, well, if you don't know any of this stuff and you've got a lot of unbalanced energies, you can fire off infinite creativity and you don't have any control of it. And that's very much what was represented by, I think the film is Fantasia, where Mickey Mouse is trying to be a magician and all of the mops go out of control. This is what happens with ignorant sorcerers, if you want to call them that, or people who are entering into this world with no self-control and infinite desire. Right? It's really dangerous to your sanity, because unfortunately the materiality of what we're talking about is your consciousness. And so if you screw up here, there's a huge possibility you can push yourself into psychosis, right? Because if, for example, you were to turn on some kind of algorithmic process in the astral world, which wasn't well balanced and wasn't for your higher good, you wouldn't have the knowledge to know how to turn that off, right? How do you turn something like that off? That's not a straightforward process, right? You can do it using the elements. If you know how to use the elements, then you can turn it off. But that's not it's not something you're going to learn in a day, right? And if you turn on some algorithm like that, you're going to be so frightened you'll never come back to this stuff again. You know, you'll be like, this satanic, get me out of here, right? And, you know, that's how it will feel. It will feel like that. However, there's a lot of, what's interesting is all this stuff I'm talking about sounds quite esoteric, but it's been documented. Like, I tend to focus more on tantric stuff, like on the just on the structures. And I've had various charts that I've used over the years. There's a really good chart in Christopher Wallace's book, the Recognition Sutras. He's got a great chart of the descent from Prakriti and Purusha consciousness, how it descends into the physical world, how the senses and the sense organs and the elements are formed from the descent. What's interesting about that is if you look at the Tree of Life, and people tend to think of the Tree of Life as the Sephiroth, and that's about it, I guess, But the Sephiroth also, or the Tree of Life, represents all these things too. It represents, they don't call them Tanmatras, but the elements, for example, I believe in the, and I'm not an expert on Kabbalah, but I've been looking at it again because of the, because Bardon's a Kabbalist, and because Sifu Mark Rasmus is talking about this again, I'm sort of like just looking at it again. So, for example, if you look at the Tree of Life, it's divided into it's divided into 4 sections, and it's divided by the first 3 letters, or not, by 3 letters of the Jewish alphabet, which represent air, water, and fire, right? And so here we get consciousness being subdivided into different realms by the elements. And then it gets divided into the different organs and the different senses, and it's the same thing, just with a different structure. So these, this secret knowledge, which seems really esoteric, is only secret and esoteric because we don't talk about it, right? That's all. It's actually pretty heavily discussed. And so there's value in looking into the Kabbalah as a, well, one of the cool things about the Kabbalah and magic generally is that it's well documented and it's been explored by magicians. And magicians really are just they're really just unethical. They're not unethical, many of them, but they can be. But they're just people who want to know what the secrets are, right? Some of them are motivated by power, as you might be, but I think if you can break through into pure consciousness, I don't think you're going to be so worried about the other stuff. Because all of a sudden, the real jewel, the real wealth of this world is knowing this stuff. Like, I got a couple of friends from high school now who are like multimillionaires and whatnot, and like, dude, they don't know. Yeah. This is the real wealth of the world, is knowing about the descent of divinity into the monad, or whatever you want to call it, right? Anyway, really interesting stuff to do this. Anyway, what's cool about the Kabbalah stuff is it's not that they're unethical. What it is that a lot of the information has been liberated. So, for example, in the Jewish Kabbalah, you're probably not going to get advanced lessons about this unless you're Jewish and you're studying it formally, right? Same thing with Tantra. You have to go live in an ashram. Whereas a lot of the truth is, like, to understand any of this stuff, you're better off being in a group like that because it's really intense and you need guidance, right? But a lot of the magicians have revealed this stuff. So all that stuff about Kali and the lingam and the yoni having all the sexual organs, that's basically what Crowley was talking about back in the day. It was this, right? And so a lot of his elegant, poetic, magical rituals, which probably veer off the tracks. But basically, this is what they're focused on, is pushing this energy to its limit to break down structures. It's a defragmentation of consciousness kind of thing, right? But a lot of the secrets have kind of been like revealed in the magical circles. And not just that, but as I've been reviewing this material, it sort of makes you reevaluate certain practices. So, for example, in the Tree of Life, in the Jewish Tree of Life, the Sephiroth and the paths between them are defined by the letters of the Hebrew alphabet, right? So apparently, I'm not an expert in this. There's 3 special letters. I think there's another group of letters which represent the pillars, and there's another group of letters which represent the channels between the Sephiroth. But of course, like for example, some of the letters have sort of an almost pictorial significance to them. So what's interesting about this is there's like, you don't just think about the shape of the letter. There's also like a symbolic significance, right? And there might be an elemental significance. There's like a 3-pronged or 4-pronged way of evaluating each path. And the paths are ways of traveling through different aspects or different modalities of consciousness. So, for example, if you're at the bottom of the Tree of Life, Malkuth, which is sort of similar to Muladhara, and you're moving up to Yesod, which is similar to Svadhisthana, that's from the earth to the moon, or from the earth to the water element, there's like a path between those. And so there's like a contemplation which can take place between these 2 zones of consciousness. One is sort of physical awareness of the regular world, and one is consciousness of the astral world. And what is the channel? What is the path between those ideas? Now, that place, which can manifest 1,000 ways a day, you might call this the Astral Physical Matrix, right? And you'd be able to contemplate what is that matrix, sort of just looking and evaluating your consciousness during the day. Like, for example, if an emotion suddenly comes up in you, where did that emotion come from? Because that's an astral event, right? A memory surges up. Where is it coming from? Or you're feeling really uncomfortable or something. Where is it coming from? Oftentimes, it might come from the body, right? And so there's this sort of, it's maybe something to evaluate here, right? About like what is the relationship, right? Now, it's something you can evaluate just on a sort of daily, everyday consciousness level, or it's something you can contemplate in a meditative level. So one way you might do this is like meditate on the chakra, moving from you might look at the root chakra and the Svadhisthana, and you might sort of, like I like to talk about it, like pendulation. You might move back and forth between them, back and forth, and allow your consciousness to move between those 2 different states. But if you're doing it at that level, it's sort of an abstract level, right? It's not really focused on the specific problem. Now, one of the things that the Kabbalists did, the Kabbalists with a Q, the K Kabbalists are the Jewish Kabbalists, the Q Kabbalists are the magicians. But one of the things the magicians did, I think it was F.R.S. Levi did this, was he decided to pair up the major arcana of the tarot with the Tree of Life, it's kind of an interesting thing to do, because the tarot has its own set of symbology, but the major arcana also, I think, there's 22 major arcana, so it lines up the Jewish alphabet, and it can be placed over all the paths in a sort of workable way. And one of the interesting things about this is that, and this is something which I hadn't considered before, but what's interesting about evaluating paths, and this is discussed as path work. If you've ever heard about path work in Kabbalah, what they're discussing is the evaluation of different modalities of consciousness. What does it take to move from the physical to the imaginative world, right? And it's not just what does it take. A lot of it is what are your blockages. Like, so for example, some people can't think about Tantra in a sexual way. There's a blockage there. In the same way, some people might be more comfortable in their physical body and they don't want to visualize, or they can't visualize. So what are those blockages? How can you evaluate that? So there's a bunch of ways you might do it, but the Kabbalists with a Q suggested that one way might be using the tarot, So I saw somebody was using a system which I thought was really quite innovative, whereas they were using the divinatory qualities of the tarot, and what they would do is they'd shuffle the tarot and they'd choose a card for Svadhisthana and another card for Muladhara, the root and the belly chakras, and then they choose another card which represents the challenges you're facing in this path. And so what you would do is you would start meditating on the cards as a way of revealing revealing what the blockages are. What's really interesting about this is that it represents another aperture for the astral world. Now, the reason it's interesting is because if you focus on tarot cards, how interesting is that? I was reading the book by Jodorowsky, who's a well-known Chilean tarot expert. He's kind of like the Terence McKenna of South America. And Jodorowsky, who's still alive, and he does speeches in Santiago here every now and then. But he discusses the he discusses the tarot in a bunch of ways, including sensually. And in his book, he discusses how like he would like meditate with each card, and the meditation, yeah, he was really taking that to the limits of what that might involve. Let's say, I don't think he really said it, but it sounded like he might be doing sexual stuff with the cards. I can't handle that, but maybe that's what it was. I'm not sure. But the point is, he was using the filament of desire to get... The thing is you can look at cards. If you're just looking at the images of the cards, you're in the physical space. You need to enter into the astrality of the cards. And what I learned from working with the astrality of the chakras is you have to channel desire into the... You have to channel desire into the astral world to provoke astrality. And so that's how the tarot has to be contemplated. It has to be penetrated with the shaft of consciousness to provoke real feedback from what the symbolic images represent. And this seems like an interesting way of exploring the physical astral matrix, as well as the astral mental, the mental akashic, and all the other paths which exist. There's a whole bunch of ways of doing this. Of course, it will seem like a waste of time if you're not interested. If you're not into this stuff, just ignore whatever I just said. But fascinating way of doing it. Now, of course, if you're doing this, you're actually working through these paths from the astral. Now, for a lot of people, the astral is good enough. You know, you get to the astral plane, that's pretty fucking impressive, man. Shit's so impressive there that, yeah, you feel like you've made it, you know? But one of the things I learned working with the chakras is that, you know, for example, you can, like, provoke... like, when you start working with the chakras, it provokes bliss and orgasmic bliss in your body just by focusing on them. It like, oh my God, it's blissful. And for a long time, that seemed like that was the point. Was that okay? And then you'd move up to this chakra, blissful. This chakra up to the it's just blissful. You move into the fingers, everything's bliss. But after a while, I was like, is that really all it is? But bliss is really an expression of the saturation of like probably of the physical astral matrix, right? You're sort of augmenting, you're amplifying the astral matrix until it sort of like starts pouring out over into the physical world, which is incredibly pleasurable, right? But that's based on imagination and the augmentation of the imagination. But what's interesting, and you know, like I said, like my focus has really been on astrality, but there's, There's huge powers in other aspects. So, for example, the idea of sexualizing the imagination, like if you speak to a Kundalini yoga teacher, they'll think you're nuts talking about that, and they'll no just do certain postures, And who's that yogi in the 70s? The guy from Pakistan who wasn't really from any school, but he became really famous for Kundalini yoga independently. But I mean, he was saying this is that you don't really have to do anything; just do the poses and do the practices, and you'll become enlightened, right? The end. So you didn't have to do any crazy practices. But what that points to is it points to the fact that from any point, so you don't have to focus on this like symbolic, metaphoric, analogical system. You can do a lot of stuff simply from the physical plane. You can also do it from the mental plane, and then you can do it from different aspects. So, for example, I had a huge heart opening at one point, not from doing anything physical. At one point, I thought that like by provoking bliss in the heart, that would open the heart chakra, but that was the wrong. It was blissful, but bliss is the wrong language for the heart, right? The heart is unlocked using a different modality of consciousness, and the same thing's true for the third eye. And I've seen this mentioned by other people. Who was talking about this? They were talking how they were focusing the third eye, focusing the third eye, focusing the third eye, and then and nothing worked. It wouldn't open, and it wasn't until he completely stopped doing it. And I'm not sure if it was like, I'm not sure what their state was when they did this. Like they just moved into a state of no thought, and that's when it opened up. But the point is that it's easy to get into like a certain modality which works for you in certain ways and is wonderful, but it's actually not right for the if your intention is to provoke the clear channel of the of whatever we're talking about here, I think I might be done here. Let me just check. I had notes from yesterday still. Yeah. Yesterday, I did a whole section yesterday at the end talking about the Elohim and the coming return of the Devas and the aliens and this kind of stuff, which is pretty interesting stuff. But I think I'm tired. I don't want to go down that path right now. Yeah, I think I'll stop right now. I just wanted to say that was all I really wanted to talk about was the contemplation of the different channels of consciousness is mirrored in many ways between the Tree of Life and the tantric ideas. The filament of desire is what can provoke the first level of focused consciousness, and then this, the thing is like the way you transform the consciousness is very analogical to the jhanas. So in the Buddha's jhanas is when you start feeling bliss, what you do is you try and move into equanimity, or you start trying to. You're actually not trying to do this; it just happens naturally. But what happens is you move into a different state where you can observe the bliss, but you're not in the bliss. And then you move into a different state above that. So it's kind of like what I was talking about, these different states of like noticing different things, and that pushes you into the next higher state of consciousness. So the process of moving through the elements, while not exactly the same, is analogical to the process of moving through the jhanas and into extremely high states of consciousness. The hardest one to get to is the first jhana, or the second jhana, which is it's just the feeling of bliss. If you can get the feeling of bliss, that's the big one, because that's kind of like the first step of initiation into Hermetics. If you can't get to that, you can't do anything else, because everything else is based on the visceral feeling of bliss. Because once you get that, then you can channel this into anything. And all desires, all focuses of consciousness can be cleansed. So, for example, if you know what the feeling of bliss is, and then you have some negative feeling coming up, like, oh, I'm a bad person, you can take just some kind of little droplet from the bliss and extrude it through the negative feeling, right? And that extrusion of divinity, it's it will, what's the right word to use there? It will like transform all negativity. There's thousands of ways of working with this stuff, which is just really interesting. Now, of course, this is all based around the central pivot of human consciousness, right? Obviously, if you're moving into non-duality and divine consciousness, it would seem like none of this stuff matters, but for most of us, we're still dealing with our imagined human personality. And so these techniques allow us to release the magnetism we feel for the vestigial monad of human consciousness. That's good. I think I'll end it right there because that was a big word. Okay. I'll talk to you guys at some point. I've been really busy of late, so I'll try and get back to you guys. Peace.